Hello.
Oh, Doug, I forgot to tell Helen something before we left. Is she still up?
What do you mean she's still up? What do you think?
This is Betty Rollins. May I speak to Helen for a moment?
What, checking up, huh? Huh? Well, listen, the next time you and Ed are invited to a party over here, do me a favor. Don't come!
Please, the neighbors.
I said, leave her alone!
Hey, all right. And there's blood all over everything. It's just horrible. The man is crazy when he's drunk. He's killed her. I just know he has.
Miss Rollins,
yes.
You called the police?
Yes, and I should have done it last night.
Where's the husband?
He's inside.
Dan, talk to her.
The man is brutal when he's drunk. We all knew that, but I had no idea he'd go this far.
Your name?
Betty Rollins.
Mr. French.
Who the hell are you now?
Lieutenant Mike Stone.
Yeah. Yeah, well, what is the big deal? I must have had a little argument with my wife and she took off. You guys have no right. You're listening to a hysterical woman.
You had an argument?
I don't know. I don't remember.
Did this happen during the argument?
I don't know. I spilled something, maybe.
And you kept getting a busy signal?
Yes, and then when I got here this morning, the phone was off the hook. It was just lying there.
If your wife just left, wouldn't she have taken her purse?
Don't ask me. Ask her when she comes back. She always comes back.
Well, until she does, you're the only one I can talk to. There appears to be bloodstains here and in the bathroom. Was your wife hurt during the argument?
I don't know. What argument?
Well, now, is that your car parked outside?
Yeah, what?
Your wife is missing. She didn't take her purse or your car. Maybe she called someone to pick her up.
I don't know.
Do you mind if I borrow this? It's her address book.
I don't care.
Thank you. Did you go anywhere last night?
No. I stayed right here. I had a few. I went in, went to sleep, and that's all. And I still don't know what the big deal is all about.
Well, your wife is missing under a set of circumstances you can't explain. Now, that may not be a big deal as far as you're concerned, but I'm going to have to ask you to stay with this policeman until the lab men check out the rest of the house. Maybe they can explain things you can't.
So what did you notice when you first drove up?
Hysterical lady.
Excuse me.
What happened to the lady?
She left me for a hairdresser. Couldn't find it.
Anything?
Yeah, she said Mrs. French has an appointment with her dentist this morning. We'll have to find the name.
Well, I've got her address book here. Maybe it's in here. They had a party last night.
I got the names, 5 couples. Mr. French managed to insult most of them by midnight, and they all left.
Yeah, he's got problems.
Yeah.
He passed out, and he couldn't tell me anything about bloodstains in the living room or the bathroom. And then he had a hard time explaining, well, what looked like a burnt blouse in the fireplace.
He's got another problem. Take a look at this. Could be bloodstains there in the front seat. Take a look at this. That looks very fresh to me.
It sure does, doesn't it? But he said he didn't go anywhere last night. We don't have anything to hold him on, but that doesn't mean we can't impound his car. Let's find out how recent this dent is. I want this car brought in.
Very recent, Lieutenant. Last few hours.
You're sure?
No oxidation at all on the fresh scraped metal.
Did you get a sample of that stain on the front seat?
Yeah, fingerprint section also lifted some latent prints from inside.
Well, can you get a make on that blue paint that's here?
We'll do what we can.
Don't forget the tires, will you? The mud, the dirt.
Next on the list, Lieutenant.
Good.
Here's something you might find interesting. We found this credit card receipt on the front seat.
It's a car wash. Made out yesterday. Huh. That means that these were left here since then.
Lipstick on both of them. Maybe your lady in question was driving the car herself.
Oh, no way.
Why not?
I checked out Helen French's purse. There were no cigarettes, matches, or lighter. I say she's a non-smoker.
Well, she's also non-existent since midnight last night. Nobody from the party has heard from her. Cab companies don't show a call at that address. She's not a patient in any hospital.
What about her dental appointment?
She didn't keep it. I talked to her dentist, and he said she didn't even call to cancel her appointment, which is, quote, very unlike Mrs. French.
Did you check out her accident reports?
4 hit and runs so far from last night. None of them seem to match up with French's car.
All right, until anything more turns up, we'll just have to keep looking for the lady.
Huh?
That's right. Every name in that book, one by one by one.
So you know Mr. and Mrs. French?
Sure, but I haven't seen Helen or Doug for a couple of years. Ever since my mouth healed up.
Forgot to duck, huh?
And who needs a guy like that?
Mrs. French still has you and your wife in her address book. Have you heard from her?
No. I think she was embarrassed to call after what happened.
Did you and Mr. French used to work together?
Sure. Doug and I used to pedal for the same company. Then Doug switched to this new outfit. Shot up in the company. Fat expense account, lots of booze. Booze is one thing he couldn't handle. Believe me, it cost me 2 teeth. I don't know how Helen takes it. She must think the only 2 colors in the world are black and blue.
He beats her? You know that for sure?
Nobody runs into doors that often. My wife used to see her after she'd spent a week in that private hospital. Still wearing shades to cover up the black eyes. Face like a lump.
Do you know what private hospital she went to?
Kind of a convalescent place. Payson. No, Pearson. Helen used to go there to cover for Doug.
I thought I had managed to keep my name out of police records, Lieutenant. Don't tell me some gentleman has filed a complaint.
No, your name isn't in the police records. It's right here in Helen French's address book. Soames. Angela Soames.
Oh, excuse me. Hello? Well, of course I remember you. Aren't you sweet to say so? Give me half an hour to become desirable. All right. Oh, I know. I'll be there. I really shouldn't talk that way in front of a cop, should I?
It's been 12 years since I worked with Vice.
Oh, Lieutenant, I'm an interior decorator. A gentleman calls, and I go over and decorate his otherwise bleak world for a while.
Well, interior decorating isn't in my department. I'm looking for Helen French.
Oh, God. Don't tell me he's beaten her up again.
We don't know what's happened to her. By any chance, she hadn't called you since last night, did she?
No. Poor Helen. Poor lost Helen. I hope you never find her. She was a prisoner. That's the kind it happens to, you know.
What happens?
I've known Helen since high school.
Did you know her husband?
Thank heavens, no. Our friendship was separate from that side of her life. Helen married the first man who stole her innocence. Doug French. Big shot, going places. Not long, the little girl becomes a doormat. Then she becomes a punching bag.
She told you all that?
I often wished his girlfriend could see him beating up on his wife.
He beat his wife. And you say he has a girlfriend?
Oh, Helen knew about it. Susan somebody or other.
Maybe that explains the cigarette butts in the ashtray, huh?
Yeah, maybe.
The lab says that the blood found on the carpet, in the bathroom, and on that scrap of woman's blouse from the fireplace all matched the blood in the car, type O. And according to the Pearson Convalescent Hospital, where Helen French has been an occasional patient, her blood type is O.
And they haven't heard from her this time?
Nope. Tried to get some particulars, but they're closed-mouthed. They said that her regular doctor's in St. Louis attending a seminar.
So she didn't go back to her regular hospital? None of her friends have heard from her? I don't like it.
Pick 'em up.
On what charge? Assault? We can't make that stick.
Come on, Mike. Don't you think we're dealing with something more than a messy house and a missing persons report?
Sure. But what have we got? Nothing. Unless we can prove that he lied about never leaving the house last night.
Okay, so we have to prove he had opportunity to dispose of the body, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Now you're cooking. Homicide, Stone. Yeah, that fits. Is the witness still there? Okay, we're on our way. Early morning hit and run, just reported. Sounds good.
Did you say witness?
That's what I said. Come on.
Let's go.
Well, I'm just coming off work, night shift. I'm a waiter in this restaurant right here. And I come out from my car, and I see this big bozo weaving all over the street. Almost hits me.
Did you see the car?
Yellow sedan, and wham, he smacks right into me. Parked. Just sitting here.
What time did it happen?
Oh, about 2:30 in the morning. I remember, I had just cleaned up, walked out, and I figured I better check it today, you know, for my insurance. The car's been sitting here since the accident.
Did you see the driver of the vehicle?
This close he was, almost hit me. Oh, yeah, a big guy, reddish hair, navy blue jacket.
Douglas French was arrested on suspicion of murder today following the unexplained disappearance of his wife, Helen. While police will not reveal what evidence they have gathered to support the charge, they are reportedly seeking a mystery woman in connection with the case.
Well, Susan, so now you're a mystery woman. You worried about this?
Damned right I am.
They were married in 1963.
Your Honor, the people strongly recommend that a higher bail be set in this particular instance. The evidence clearly indicates that the defendant attempted to mislead the investigating officers about where he was on the night in question.
Your Honor, if the investigating officers have been misled, it is only by their own zeal to string together flimsy bits of purely circumstantial evidence.
All right, gentlemen. Let's don't try the defendant nor the San Francisco Police Department today. Mr. Filer, your motion for continuance is denied. The defendant is bound over for a preliminary hearing before the Superior Court on the 25th, 9 a.m.
Mike, I got something for you.
$25,000. Court's adjourned.
Thank you, Your Honor.
What's the matter? The DA made it stick, didn't he?
Yeah, sure. But a tough jury could make it come unstuck. Our job isn't done yet.
His company's making bail for him.
Good, I'm glad. Maybe he'll get nervous, stumble around, and show us where he hid the body.
Like bodies, I found a warm one. Our mystery lady's no mystery anymore. The lab came up with a lady who left her prints in French's car.
Now, you bring good news. Where do we go?
That's the kicker, named Susan Ross, and she lives just 2 blocks from where French slammed into that other car.
Don't give me an answer now. I want you to mull it over.
If you think I'm guilty, take a walk. I'm going to find somebody else.
That's just your problem, you know? I don't know what to think. You haven't told me anything,
I
Doug.
told you, I don't know anything. I passed out. I can't remember.
Doug, no jury in the world is going to buy that. Now, listen to me. I've got to be honest with you. I tried to make a great show in there of sweeping circumstantial evidence away like it was so much dirt. Well, it isn't. It's damned incriminating. And there are plenty of guys doing life right now on a whole lot less. Do you understand that? So I've got to have the truth. I mean, if it's bad, we'll plea bargain. We'll go for a reduced charge.
You want the truth?
Yes, I want the truth.
So do I. Set up a polygraph test for me.
A polygraph?
A lie detector test. Set it up.
Look, I tell you, I haven't seen Doug French in 2-3 months.
I don't believe you, Miss Ross. I believe you saw Mr. French the same day. Maybe even the same night his wife disappeared.
I want to talk to a lawyer.
We already told you you're entitled to one.
If you come downtown with us, I promise you there'll be a lawyer present.
No, wait.
You know, Mr. French had his car washed the same day. And afterwards, we found cigarette butts with lipstick on them in his ashtray. Same kind. Mrs. French doesn't smoke. We also found your fingerprints on the dashboard and on the car handle.
All right. All right, so he was here.
Well, now, why didn't you say so from the start?
Because I don't want to get involved.
But you are involved. Now, what time was he here?
He called around 1, I guess.
1 in the morning?
Yes, he'd been drinking. I could tell. I didn't. Told him I'd be outside. I don't want him up here when he's been drinking.
Where'd you go with him?
We didn't go anywhere. We just sat in his car and talked. Maybe an hour.
What'd you talk about?
I don't remember. Just talk, that's all.
Did he say anything about his wife, about what happened that night?
No, I don't know anything about his wife.
Bloodstains in the car?
Bloodstains? No,
You're doing it again.
What?
Lying. We know there were bloodstains in the car. If you saw any such evidence, if Mr. French told you anything about what happened to his wife, you could be an accessory to murder.
Are you accusing me?
No, nobody is accusing you. But you are making it very difficult for us to believe you.
Is your name Douglas French?
Yes.
Are you employed by the Overdyne Corporation?
Yes.
Did you kill your wife?
No.
I don't get it. He is intentionally sticking his neck out. Why?
Maybe they're trying to dazzle us with footwork, Mike. French is a professional salesman, and a lawyer's good. He'll take the right case to a jury. Maybe they think French can beat the poly. Anyway, they got nothing to lose. We're going all the way.
Helen French's doctor's back in town. You want to make an appointment?
As soon as we can get a reading on his blood pressure in there.
Well, he isn't lying.
If he was a pathological liar, would it show?
No, because if he was a pathological liar, it wouldn't show up in the graph.
He says he can't remember. What do you say?
If this guy is a blackout alcoholic, it's possible that he really doesn't remember. I had a case once where an alcoholic flew coast to coast, stopped in 4 states, got home, sobered up. He didn't even remember leaving the last bar he was in.
Mike, I don't want to let this guy off on a reduced plea. I want to prove that French formed the intent in advance, before he got himself drunk enough to really do it.
Well, I guess it's time we saw a doctor. Say, how many times has Mrs. French been a patient here, Doctor?
I'd have to consult the admitting records to be certain. Oh, perhaps 5 or 6 times in the past 3 years.
Were her injuries serious?
Well, whenever there are severe bruises and lacerations about the face and the ears, possibility of concussions, I'd say they could be serious.
Well, did she ever tell you that her husband had beaten her?
No, Lieutenant, I couldn't testify to that under oath. She implied that, but that's all.
Tell me, did you ever try to offer her any advice?
Well, naturally, I recommended marriage counseling. I understand her husband refused.
Did she have any outside interests?
Not really. Oh, for a while, she was with a little theater group, Stage West, I think. She seemed interested. I don't know how it worked out.
You get a lot of cases like this?
Too many. Seminar I just attended, they claim that wife beating is the single most unreported crime in the country.
And sometimes we hear about it too late, after they're dead.
Oh. Oh, no.
Is that where you hid the body, Mr. French? I'm asking you a question. Is that where you buried your wife?
God help me. I don't know.
Looks like our stakeout on him's not gonna pay off. Maybe he really doesn't know, or can't remember. How do you read him?
How do I read him? I don't read him.
No dice, Lieutenant. We've covered every square foot.
Okay, Tanner, pack it in. What about it, Lieutenant? He can go. Thank you very much.
I really thought we had him.
Well, he's had one nightmare. Maybe he'll have another one. I still want a tail on him around the clock.
Mike, what if he's telling the truth?
What, that he didn't kill her?
Maybe she killed herself. I mean, a lady like that, beaten, afraid to go home, afraid to complain, maybe she just crawled off somewhere.
Maybe. But either way, if he killed her or if she killed herself, we still have to find the body.
Okay, so where do we look? There must be a million places.
I don't know. Where do we look? Who knows where to look? Maybe we ought to go to that little theater group the doctor was talking about.
How's that gonna help? They wouldn't know where he buried her.
Well, somebody there might know something about her habits. Might give us a clue.
There's supposed to be 3 glasses there. Now, I want 3 there tonight, okay? Excuse me. As we were saying, the people who come here are frustrated. They're fearful, unfulfilled. They're beautiful.
What about Helen French?
She was a cocoon. Wrapped, rigid.
I'm beginning to understand why.
Oh, yes. An occasional bruise would appear. Accident, she claimed. Her husband never came around.
Did she like it here?
I began to unwrap the threads that were restraining her. There are no directors in New York anymore, you know. They're all choreographers. Well, I cast her in a small but vital part, an inspiration. She played a bouncy broad on the make for another woman's husband. Why, what a metamorphosis. She emerged, spread her wings. Lovely to see.
Was she good?
We'll never know. She just disappeared before the dress rehearsal.
Never gave any reason?
Well, in retrospect, she may have had bruises that makeup wouldn't cover.
Did she make any friends while she was here? I mean, were there any relationships with other members? Someone she could have gone off with?
You are an astute observer of the human scene, Lieutenant. They come here to play out their fantasies. All their fantasies. Even Helen. Oh, at first, she was afraid of men. Until I put her on that stage. She was really quite good.
Doug, I'm scared.
What are you talking about? What's the matter with you?
Well, didn't the police tell you?
They don't tell me anything. You tell me.
Well, they know about us. Doug, they came to talk to me. Lieutenant Stone and some younger guy.
About what?
Well, they know that we were together that night.
What?
Don't you remember? You came over late and we sat in your car, remember?
You told them that?
Well, I couldn't deny it. They already had my fingerprints from out of your car.
What else did you tell them?
Well, I didn't tell them about the rest, honest, Doug. But I'm afraid. I mean, if they make me get up on that stand, I can't lie. I'll go to prison.
What are you saying?
Doug, don't you remember?
Remember what?
You had blood all over you, and you were saying wild things.
What things?
About killing your wife. Come. Look, don't you see? They'll make me tell it. I know they will. Doug, I don't want to hurt you. Maybe I better get out of town. For you.
Where will you go?
Far away. Maybe out of the country. Doug, I'm going to need some money. You got to help me.
I've got some you can have, I guess.
Well, not just some. I'm going to need a lot to get away where they can't find me.
How much?
$10,000 at least.
I don't have that kind of cash.
Well, how much? How much can you get?
Five, maybe five. I've got a joint savings account.
Doug, I want to get away tonight. Can you get it?
Yes.
It's not for me, Doug. It's for you. Look, you bring the money by my apartment, and I'll be packed and ready to leave. Okay?
All right.
Okay.
All right.
Let's go. Hi, Johnny? Yeah, it's me. Oh, yeah. He bought it. Oh, come on, Lieutenant, be honest. You found me irresistible, right?
Well, I would hate to deny that under oath. But actually, I'm still interested in Helen French.
Can't win them all. Did you find her?
No, we're still looking.
You're a real doll, you know. I could shatter your reserve off duty.
Well, I'm not going to argue that point with you. But could I ask you a personal question? I mean, about Mrs. French.
Shoot.
Sometimes when a wife finds out that her husband is playing around,
She goes out and does a little freelance romancing herself, right? Not Helen, Lieutenant. Not that I didn't try. I told her that I could get her lots of company with men who would treat her tenderly.
but she wasn't interested.
Married to a monster like that could turn you off men altogether.
Funny. Really is funny how some women can handle all kinds of men, and then there are some who find it difficult to handle just one.
Well, let me tell you something even funnier, Lieutenant. This is right down your alley. Nice society out there is hell-bent on persecuting the likes of me. But they don't even care that the Helens are getting beaten, killed. Poor little fool.
Fool? No. Poor lost victim. Thank you for your time. Homicide, Stone.
I lost him, Mike.
Well, did you lose him or did he lose you?
Well, he looked too smashed to even know I was following him.
Well, come on, let's have it.
He met a woman fitting the Ross girl's description at Fisherman's Wharf earlier. Then he made a visit to a savings and loan bank, and when he came out, he was carrying a big wad of dough.
Well, where did you lose him?
He spent a while in a bar. Now, I picked him up when he came out, and then I lost him in traffic. But it looks like he may be headed towards the girl's neighborhood.
All right, see if you can pick him up again. We're on our way.
We'll worry about that when we get to Mexico. At least then I'll be rid of this creep, and then we can be together. No, silly, I didn't sleep with him. I just scared the hell out of him. Oh, he'll bring the money, don't worry about it. He can stop shaking long enough to sign for it. No.
You lied to me, you little tramp!
You get away from me!
I'll kill you.
You're crazy! You're crazy!
Take it easy. Take it easy.
I don't know any more than I've already told you.
You yelled out he killed her. Now he's trying to kill me.
Well, he did kill her, didn't he?
You tell us. He says that you tried to extort money from him.
He's lying.
He had $5,000 in his pocket when he came to your apartment. He said he got it for you.
Well, I only asked for his help to get away for a while so that I wouldn't get involved in all this.
What was he paying you for? To help him dispose of his wife's body?
No!
The real reason he didn't go up to your apartment that night was that he didn't want to leave the body alone in the car, right?
No. I didn't see anything.
Now, why didn't you let him go to your apartment?
Because my boyfriend was up there.
Oh, now we know. A boyfriend, huh?
Look, I have been trying to get rid of Doug for a long time. It's not easy.
And suddenly it became easier, didn't it? He told you that he had killed his wife, and you thought, well, now, here's my chance to blackmail him and go off with number two.
No, that is not how it happened.
Why don't you sit here for a while and think it over? Come on. Let's book her. Suspicion of extortion. Tanner said they met around noon. Let's find out what time Mr. French withdrew that money from the bank and when he stopped at the bar. Let's check it all out.
Good idea.
Sekulovich, Booker.
Okay, Lieutenant.
Here we are. The withdrawal receipt was signed by Douglas M. French, $5,000.
Mr. French leave a balance after taking that much out?
$112.68.
She darn near cleaned him out, didn't she? You know, we're going to need a positive identification of this signature. Could you verify it?
I think so. We have the information and signature cards they filled out when they opened the account. The signature looks genuine. Wouldn't you say, Lieutenant?
Yeah, it certainly does. The account was opened 3 years ago.
What's the matter?
Take a look at that.
Hello. I think we have a mutual friend. The telephone company?
All I had was a number. You're, Angela, right?
Right. That's the trouble with the world. We're all just numbers. But you had a nice voice. You match your voice. Not many people do.
Thank you. Would you like a drink?
Scotch. Very light. Yours too. Very light. I don't want you to dull your senses.
I don't drink. Still, to the telephone company?
That's for free. But, unfortunately, business ethics require that I collect for the retirement fund before I show you my birthmark.
Well, if there's one thing I admire, it's ethics. Second only to, birthmarks.
Now, you can get comfy. Sit down. Tell me a story. Something wrong?
No, nothing.
I know what's bothering you. You're suffocating.
No,
Here.
it's not that. Look, I'm sorry.
What's the matter? You don't like me?
No, I do like you. It's just that, well, I guess I'm a little kinky about certain things.
Surprised me.
Not kinky. It's, look, you're beautiful. You're really beautiful. But I've got this thing about, you know, all that makeup and stuff on your face.
What?
Well, I told you, kinky.
That's the whole deal?
Would you mind, taking it off?
Just you watch. Mother Nature's about to astound you.
Look, I hope you don't mind.
You hush. Some gals wouldn't do this, you know.
I suppose not.
Now what's the matter?
Is that your wife?
You know I fit through because of you?
You didn't hide the body. She hid the body for you. Come on, take a look at her. Take a look at her. Take a good look at the woman you killed.
Hey, Mike, wait up.
Say, are you still going to prosecute French for assault?
No, you know, it's the same old story, Mike. Bad evidence, bad witnesses.
No justice.
Due process of law. By the way, something in a bank file put you onto her. What was it?
Well, when you open a new savings account in this state, you've got to always give your mother's maiden name.
Oh?
So she gave her mother's maiden name. Soames, Angela Soames. Must have been a pretty comfortable name for her, especially when she wanted to escape from herself.
Well, at least she's alive.
Alive? I don't know about that. I talked to her doctor. He said that she's going to be institutionalized for a long time. A long time.
That's life. See ya.
I cannot even remember breakfast. How about getting some food?
Yes, I'd like that.
What do you feel like?
Oh, I don't know. Why don't you think of something? Maybe something kinky. Not kinky, but kinky.
I'll give you kinky.
The fog rolled in from the Pacific like a slow confession, softening the neon glare and dampening the late-night traffic along the sloping streets of San Francisco, and Inspector Mike Stone stood with his coat collar turned up against the chill as he watched the patrol car lights paint the brick facade of a narrow apartment building in restless shades of red and blue. A familiar pulse that meant someone's life had just ended while the rest of the city kept moving, unaware, and beside him. Sergeant Steve Keller shifted his weight, notebook already in hand, eyes alert in the way of a man still learning how much detail mattered and how quickly it could disappear if not caught in time, because this city never paused long enough for grief to settle before the next siren cut through the night, and Stone, who had seen enough nights like this to know that every murder began as a quiet interruption in someone's ordinary routine, stepped under the yellow tape and into the lobby where the smell of floor polish and stale cigarette smoke clung to the walls, and a uniformed officer nodded toward the stairwell and said it was the third floor, apartment 3B, a woman named Helen French, found by a neighbor who'd heard a thud and assumed it was furniture being moved until the silence afterward felt wrong enough to check. And as Stone and Keller climbed the stairs, the old building creaked under their steps like it resented the intrusion, each landing lit by a single bulb that flickered, just enough to make the shadows uncertain, and Keller asked quietly if there was anything yet from the responding officers, anything that pointed to forced entry or a known suspect. But Stone only shook his head because he preferred to see things for himself before forming the kind of early conclusions that could lead a case down the wrong alley. And at the top of the stairs, the door to 3B stood open, the hallway outside crowded with the low murmur of uniforms and the rustle of evidence bags. And inside, Helen French lay on the living room floor in a way that suggested both suddenness and resistance, her body turned slightly toward the doorway as if she had been moving either to answer a knock or to escape one, and the room itself held the scattered details of a life interrupted, an open handbag on the sofa, a glass with a faint ring of lipstick on the coffee table, a record still spinning on a turntable that crackled softly between songs, and Stone crouched beside the body with the practiced care of a man who respected the final stillness of the dead even as he searched for the story written in their last moments, noting the angle of her arm, the faint bruising at her wrist, the absence of obvious forced entry, and he asked the attending officer for the preliminary observations, hearing that there were signs of a struggle, but nothing overturned dramatically, no shattered furniture or broken glass, just a subtle displacement that suggested the violence had been quick, close, and perhaps personal, and Keller moved through the apartment with deliberate restraint, careful not to disturb anything as he took in the framed photographs on the wall. Helen smiling beside friends at what looked like a dinner party, Helen in front of a city landmark, Helen alone in a candid shot that hinted at a quiet confidence, and he wondered aloud what kind of life she led, whether she lived alone, whether anyone expected her home that night, and Stone said they would find out soon. Enough, because the dead always left behind a trail of connections that could be followed if one was patient, and patience, in this city, was the only way to separate truth from coincidence, and when the coroner arrived and began his work, Stone stepped back toward the window and looked out at the street below, where the fog pressed close against the glass like a curtain drawn to hide what had happened inside. And he thought about how many times he had stood in rooms like this, trying to piece together the last minutes of a stranger's life, trying to imagine the sound of the knock at the door, the recognition or surprise in Helen's eyes, the moment when routine gave way to fear, and Keller joined him by the window and said quietly that the neighbor who found her was waiting downstairs, ready to talk, and Stone nodded, taking one last look around the apartment before heading out, because the first statements were often the freshest and the least filtered by memory's tendency to reshape itself under pressure, and downstairs the neighbor, a middle-aged woman in a robe and slippers, clutched her hands together as she described hearing a heavy sound sometime after 10, not quite a crash, but enough to make her pause, and then nothing, no voices, no footsteps leaving, just an uneasy silence that made her check the hallway and notice the door to 3 be slightly ajar. And when she pushed it open and saw Helen on the floor, she called the police immediately, and Stone asked if she had seen anyone entering or leaving the building that evening, anyone unfamiliar. But the neighbor shook her head and said people came and went all the time. It was the kind of building where you minded your own business, and Keller jotted down every detail while Stone considered the timeline, the lack of forced entry, the possibility that Helen had known whoever came through that door, and outside, the patrol cars had begun to disperse, leaving only the steady presence of the unmarked sedan. That Stone and Keller would soon climb into, carrying with them the first fragile threads of a case that had already begun to weave itself into something more complicated than a simple break-in or a random act, because there was something in the arrangement of the room, in the stillness of the struggle, that suggested intention rather than impulse, and as they drove through the fog-softened streets toward the station, Keller asked what they knew about Helen French beyond her name and address, and Stone said they would know more by morning, because the city kept records on everyone, employment, acquaintances, habits, and somewhere in those details would be the reason someone had come to her door and ended her life, and Keller leaned back in his seat, watching the streetlights slide past like slow-moving stars, and thought about how every case began with a single unanswered question that grew heavier with each passing hour. And in this one, the question hung in the air between them like the fog itself, who had wanted Helen French dead badly enough to walk into her apartment and make sure she never saw another San Francisco morning, and Stone, who had learned over years of investigation that the first answer was rarely the final one, simply drove on in silence, letting the city's restless energy fill the car while the pieces of the puzzle waited to be uncovered one careful step at a time. And somewhere in the distance a siren wailed, reminding them both that the night was far from over and that the story of Helen French was only just beginning, its threads stretching outward into the lives of friends, co-workers, and strangers who would soon find themselves drawn into the orbit of a murder that refused to remain quiet, because in a city like San Francisco the truth had a way of surfacing no matter how thick the fog, and Stone intended to follow that truth wherever it led. even if it meant peeling back layers of secrecy and confronting the kind of motives that turned ordinary evenings into crime scenes. And as they reached the station and stepped out into the cold glow of the streetlights, Keller realized that this case, like so many before it, would demand not just evidence and interviews, but an understanding of the fragile intersections between people's lives, the hidden resentments and desires that could erupt without warning. And he felt the familiar mix of determination and unease that came with every new investigation, knowing that somewhere out there was a person who had walked away from Helen French's apartment believing they had left no trace, and it would be up to them to prove otherwise, to reconstruct the final hours of a woman whose story had ended too abruptly, and to answer the question that would follow them through the days and nights ahead until it was resolved. Who killed Helen French, and why did they believe they could get away with it? The morning came reluctantly, as if the city itself hesitated to look too closely at what had happened the night before, and Inspector Mike Stone stood at the window of the squad room with a cup of coffee that had already gone lukewarm, watching the pale light creep across the rooftops while the early shift settled into its rhythm of ringing phones, typewriters, and the quiet tension that accompanied every fresh case. And across from him, Sergeant Steve Keller sifted through the initial reports gathered overnight, piecing together the first outline of Helen French's life from the fragments that had already begun to surface: employment records, a driver's license, a handful of addresses and phone numbers scribbled in the margins of a small address book found in her apartment. And Stone turned from the window and asked what they had so far, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a man who knew that the first hours of an investigation often set the tone for everything that followed. And Keller reported that Helen French was 32. Worked as an administrative assistant for a mid-sized shipping firm downtown, had lived in the apartment for just over a year, and appeared to have no immediate family in the city, though there were indications of a brother in Los Angeles and a former roommate whose name came up in an old lease. And Stone nodded slowly, absorbing each detail as if fitting pieces into an invisible framework, because in his experience the victim's life always held the key to understanding the crime. And if Helen had opened her door to someone willingly, then that someone had to exist somewhere within the network of her daily routines. And Keller added that there were no signs of forced entry, the lock intact, the chain unfastened, which suggested she either knew the person who entered or felt no reason to fear them. And Stone set his cup down and reached for his coat, because the next step was obvious. They needed to talk to the people who had seen Helen in the days and hours leading up to her death, to trace her movements backward until the path intersected with someone who had reason to visit her that night. And as they headed out into the corridor and down toward the parking lot, the city had already begun to shake off its fog, revealing a crisp, cool morning that carried the scent of the bay and the low hum of traffic building toward the day's first rush. And Keller slid into the passenger seat of the unmarked car with a folder in his lap, reading off the first stop, Helen's workplace, a modest office building near the waterfront where employees arrived early to manage shipments and schedules. And Stone drove with the steady focus of a man accustomed to navigating both streets and conversations, knowing that interviews required a different kind of awareness, one that caught not just what people said but how they said it, the pauses, the hesitations, the glances that betrayed more than words ever could. And when they arrived at the office, they were met by a receptionist whose polite composure wavered at the mention of Helen's name, her expression shifting from routine courtesy to something more guarded, and she led them to a manager who spoke in careful, measured tones about Helen's reliability, her punctuality, the fact that she had left work at her usual time the previous afternoon with no indication that anything unusual was planned for the evening. And Keller asked whether Helen had mentioned meeting anyone or receiving visitors. But the manager shook his head, saying she kept her personal life mostly to herself, friendly but private, the kind of employee who did her job well and didn't invite unnecessary attention. And Stone listened without interrupting, watching the manager's face for any flicker of discomfort or withheld information, but saw only the subdued concern of someone who had just learned that a colleague was dead. And after a few more questions, they moved on to Helen's desk, where a small collection of personal items remained exactly as she had left them: a framed photograph of a beach, a potted plant that needed watering, a stack of neatly organized files. And Keller carefully examined the surface for anything that might hint at a recent change in her routine. any note or message that suggested she had plans beyond the ordinary, but there was nothing obvious. Just the quiet order of a life that had been interrupted without warning, and as they left the office and returned to the car, Keller admitted that it felt like they were chasing a ghost, because so far Helen's life appeared almost deliberately uneventful, and Stone said that was often how it began, with a surface that revealed nothing and a depth that required patience to uncover, and their next stop was the apartment building again, this time to speak with other tenants who might have seen or heard something the previous night. And the hallway on the third floor seemed different in daylight, less ominous, but no less heavy with the knowledge of what had occurred there, and they knocked on doors, introducing themselves, asking careful questions about visitors, noises, anything out of the ordinary, and most responses were polite but unhelpful, the residents either absent at the time or too accustomed to the building's constant ebb and flow of people to notice one more set of footsteps, until they reached an older man who lived directly across from Helen and recalled hearing voices some time before. The thud the neighbor had described, a man's voice, low and tense, and Helen's voice, sharper than usual, as if in argument, though he couldn't make out the words, and Stone leaned forward slightly, sensing the first real deviation from the quiet narrative they had been hearing all morning, and asked whether the voice was familiar, whether the tenant had ever seen anyone visiting Helen regularly, and the man hesitated, then said he thought he had seen the same man a few times over the past month, tall, dark hair, well-dressed, the kind of person who didn't look out of place but also didn't linger long enough to be remembered clearly, and Keller wrote down every detail while Stone thanked the tenant and stepped back into the hallway, his mind already turning over the implications, because a recurring visitor suggested a relationship of some kind, and relationships often carried the motives that led to violence. And as they descended the stairs and stepped out into the street again, the day had grown brighter, the fog fully lifted, and the city moved with its usual urgency, unaware of the quiet shift that had just occurred in the investigation, a shift from uncertainty toward the first outline of a suspect, and Keller asked what they would do next, and Stone said they would start by identifying the man described by the neighbor, cross-referencing Helen's known contacts with anyone who matched the description, checking phone records, workplace acquaintances, and any other connections that might reveal who had been visiting her in recent weeks, because somewhere in those connections lay the answer to why Helen French had opened her door that night and why she had not lived to close it again. And as they drove away from the apartment building, the sunlight glinted off the windshield, and Stone felt the familiar pull of a case beginning to take shape, the slow gathering of facts that would eventually form a picture clear enough to act upon, and he knew from experience that the path ahead would not be straightforward, that each new discovery would likely lead to more questions before it led to answers, but he also knew that persistence, careful listening, and a willingness to look beyond the obvious were the tools that solved murders in a city as layered and complex as San Francisco. And as Keller flipped through his notes and prepared to start the next round of calls, the question that had hung over them since the night before felt slightly less abstract, slightly closer to resolution, because somewhere out there was a man who had stood in Helen French's apartment and left it with her life extinguished, and it was only a matter of time before they found him and asked the question that would determine everything that followed. The investigation began to settle into its second day with the quiet determination that followed the first shock of discovery, and Inspector Mike Stone sat at his desk turning over the thin stack of notes that now represented everything they knew about Helen French, aware that each new name or detail could either illuminate the truth or send them drifting into another dead end. And across from him, Sergeant Steve Keller worked the phones with a methodical persistence that reflected both his training and his growing instinct for the rhythms of a case, checking employment records, cross-referencing addresses, and slowly building a list of individuals who had intersected with Helen's life in ways that might matter, and the description offered by the neighbor, a tall man with dark hair, well-dressed and seen visiting on more than one occasion, had already begun to narrow their focus, because it suggested a relationship that was neither casual nor entirely secret, and Stone knew from experience that such relationships often left traces in the routines and habits of the people involved, whether in the form of shared acquaintances, overlapping schedules, or the kind of subtle changes that co-workers noticed without fully understanding. And as the morning wore on, Keller received a call from a colleague in records who had pulled Helen's recent phone logs, noting several recurring numbers that stood out from the rest, including one that appeared frequently in the evenings over the past few weeks. And when Keller read the number aloud, Stone recognized the area code as local, a detail that made the connection feel immediately more tangible, and within minutes they had a name attached to it. A man named Richard Calder, listed as a consultant for a financial firm downtown, unmarried, with an address in a newer apartment complex across town. And Stone leaned back slightly, considering the possibilities, because the pattern of calls suggested familiarity, perhaps even intimacy. And if Calder was indeed the man seen visiting Helen, then he might hold the key to understanding what had brought him to her door on the night she died. And Keller prepared to make the call while Stone watched, aware that the first contact with a potential suspect often set the tone for everything that followed. And when Calder answered, he sounded composed, even polite, though there was a slight hesitation when Keller introduced himself and mentioned Helen's name, a pause just long enough to suggest that he was choosing his words carefully. And he confirmed that he knew Helen, that they had been seeing each other casually, though he insisted there had been no recent conflict and that he had not seen her the previous night, claiming he had been home alone working late. And Stone signaled for Keller to ask whether anyone could confirm that alibi. And Calder admitted there was no one else present, but offered the explanation with a steady voice that did not immediately betray nervousness. And after arranging to meet later that afternoon at the station, Keller hung up and looked to Stone, who simply nodded and said they would see what Calder had to say in person, because tone and posture often revealed more than words over the phone ever could. And the hours before the meeting were spent gathering as much background as possible, learning that Calder's employment history was stable, his reputation at work unremarkable, and his record with the department clean, though there were a few minor complaints in past years involving heated arguments in public places, nothing that had escalated to charges, but enough to suggest a temper that could flare under the right circumstances. And by the time Calder arrived at the station, the afternoon light had begun to slant through the windows in long, pale bands, and he entered with the composed demeanor of a man accustomed to professional settings, dressed neatly, his expression carefully neutral. And when he sat across from Stone and Keller in the interview room, he folded his hands on the table as if preparing for a business meeting rather than a police inquiry. And Stone began with simple questions about how long he had known Helen, how they had met, and what their relationship had been in recent weeks. And Calder answered without visible hesitation, explaining that they had met through mutual friends at a social gathering, that they had seen each other occasionally for dinners and evenings out, but that the relationship had never been serious. And Keller asked about the frequency of his visits to her apartment, noting that a neighbor had seen him there more than once. And Calder acknowledged that he had stopped by from time to time, usually unannounced but always welcome, though he insisted there had been no argument between them recently. And Stone watched him closely, noting the way his gaze shifted slightly when discussing the previous night, the way his fingers tightened briefly before relaxing again. And he asked directly whether Calder had been at Helen's apartment after 10 o'clock, and Calder said no, his voice firm but not defensive, repeating that he had been home working on a report and had not left his apartment. And Keller pressed gently, asking whether Helen had mentioned any other visitors or plans, and Calder said he was not aware of any, though he admitted they had spoken on the phone earlier in the week, and she had seemed distracted, perhaps worried about something she had not fully explained. And Stone leaned forward slightly, sensing the possibility of another thread to follow, and asked whether Calder knew what might have been troubling her. But Calder shook his head, saying she had simply said she would explain later. And the conversation circled through timelines and details for nearly an hour, with Calder maintaining his composure and repeating his alibi. And when it ended, Stone and Keller stepped into the hallway to confer, both aware that while Calder's story was plausible, it lacked corroboration, and the neighbor's description placed him at the apartment in recent weeks, if not necessarily on the night of the murder. And Stone said they would need to verify Calder's movements independently, check for any evidence that contradicted his account, and continue exploring Helen's life for other connections that might explain her apparent unease in the days before her death. And as they returned to their desks, the city outside had begun to dim again, the second evening of the investigation approaching with the same quiet inevitability as the first, and Keller felt the familiar mixture of momentum and uncertainty that came with the case still in its early stages, because while Calder represented their strongest lead so far, there was always the possibility that the truth lay elsewhere, hidden in the details they had yet to uncover, and Stone, who had learned to trust both evidence and intuition in equal measure, simply gathered the reports and prepared for another long night of careful work, knowing that somewhere within the growing web of names and timelines was the answer to the question that had first brought them to Helen French's apartment. Who had stood in her living room that night and ended her life, and what had driven them to do it? And until that answer was clear, the case would remain open, pressing forward with the steady, methodical persistence that defined their work in a city where every life, no matter how quiet, left behind a story waiting to be told. The third evening of the investigation settled over San Francisco with a muted glow that reflected off the bay and seeped into the narrow corridors of the Hall of Justice, and Inspector Mike Stone stood at the edge of the bullpen listening to the low murmur of officers trading updates, the steady clatter of typewriters underscoring the sense that this case, like so many before it, would demand patience more than brilliance. Because while Richard Calder remained their most tangible lead, nothing they had gathered so far placed him definitively in Helen French's apartment at the time of her death, and without that connection they were left with little more than a circumstantial framework that needed strengthening, and Sergeant Steve Keller, seated at his desk with a fresh stack of reports, looked up as Stone approached and began summarizing what they had learned since the afternoon interview. Noting that Calder's building manager confirmed he had access to his apartment throughout the night in question, but could not verify whether he had actually remained inside, and a neighbor down the hall recalled hearing footsteps sometime after 10, but could not say whether they belonged to Calder or someone else, and Stone nodded slowly, aware that alibis built on absence rather than presence were notoriously difficult to challenge, because they relied on what no one had seen rather than what someone had witnessed. And Keller added that Helen's phone records revealed one final outgoing call placed shortly before 10 that evening to a number not yet identified, a detail that introduced a new variable into the timeline and suggested that her last conversation might hold significance, and Stone instructed Keller to have the number traced immediately, because in his experience the final call often carried more weight than any earlier exchange, representing either a routine check-in or the beginning of something that would escalate into conflict. And as the hours passed, the office settled into the subdued rhythm of late-night work, the city outside gradually quieting while inside the investigation continued to expand, and Keller eventually received confirmation that the unidentified number belonged to a small law office across town, a place Helen had apparently contacted only once before. And when they reached the office by phone, they learned that Helen had scheduled a brief consultation earlier in the week, but had not yet followed up, a fact that introduced the possibility that she had been dealing with a personal matter serious enough to seek legal advice, and Stone considered this carefully, because people rarely consulted lawyers without reason, and whatever had prompted Helen to make that appointment might also have contributed to the tension described by her coworker and by Calder himself. And as they drove across the city to speak with the attorney in person, the streets were nearly empty, the fog beginning to return in thin strands that drifted between the streetlights. And Keller asked whether Stone believed Helen had been in trouble of some kind, perhaps dealing with a dispute or a threat that had escalated beyond her control, and Stone replied that it was too early to draw conclusions, but the pattern of her recent behavior suggested she had been preoccupied, perhaps even anxious, and if that anxiety had been connected to someone in her life, then that someone might also be connected to her death. And when they arrived at the law office, they were greeted by a young attorney who appeared surprised by their visit but cooperative, explaining that Helen had come in to ask general questions about financial matters and personal liability, nothing that immediately suggested danger, though she had seemed nervous, as if unsure how much to reveal, and Stone asked whether she had mentioned anyone by name, any conflict or concern that might have warranted legal protection, but the attorney shook his head, saying she had been vague, almost deliberately so, and had left without scheduling a follow-up. And as they returned to the car, Keller admitted that the conversation raised more questions than it answered, because while it confirmed that Helen had been dealing with something on her mind, it did not clarify what that something was or who might be involved, and Stone said that was often the nature of early leads, each one illuminating a small portion of the larger picture while leaving the rest in shadow. And back at the station, they continued to work through the growing list of contacts associated with Helen, speaking with coworkers, acquaintances, and anyone else who might have insight into her recent behavior. And one coworker mentioned that Helen had received a series of calls at work over the past week that had left her visibly unsettled, though she had brushed off questions and insisted it was nothing important. And this detail, combined with the consultation at the law office and the recurring visits from Calder, began to form a pattern of tension beneath the surface of her otherwise routine life, and Stone felt the familiar sense of a case gradually tightening, the threads drawing closer together even as the full design remained unclear. And as midnight approached, Keller returned from another round of calls with a new piece of information. A cab driver who believed he had dropped off a man matching Calder's description near Helen's apartment on the night of the murder, sometime after 10. Though he could not be certain of the exact time or the identity of his passenger, and Stone considered this carefully, because while the identification was tentative, it suggested the possibility that Calder's alibi might not hold, and he instructed Keller to locate the driver and arrange a formal interview, as well as to check for any additional witnesses who might have seen Calder in the vicinity, because corroboration, even partial, could shift the balance of the investigation. And as they stepped outside into the cool night air to clear their heads, the city felt both vast and intimate at once, its quiet streets concealing countless stories that intersected in ways no one could predict. And Keller asked whether Stone believed Calder was responsible, and Stone replied that belief had little place in their work until evidence supported it. But he acknowledged that the pieces were beginning to align in a way that could not be ignored, and somewhere within that alignment lay the truth about what had happened in Helen French's apartment, a truth that would require careful, deliberate effort to uncover without rushing to judgment. And as they returned inside and prepared for another long stretch of interviews and analysis, the question that had first brought them together on this case remained at the forefront of their minds, pressing forward with renewed urgency as each new detail emerged. And in the quiet hours before dawn, the investigation continued to move steadily toward the moment when speculation would give way to certainty, when the scattered fragments of Helen's final days would coalesce into a narrative clear enough to confront whoever had stood in her doorway that night and change the course of her life forever. And until that moment arrived, Stone and Keller would continue to follow every lead, question every assumption, and trace every connection. Because in a city as layered as San Francisco, the truth rarely revealed itself easily, but it always left a path for those willing to look closely enough to find it. By the time the fifth day of the investigation began, the city had settled into a rhythm that felt deceptively normal, the fog lifting and returning in its familiar cycles while Inspector Mike Stone and Sergeant Steve Keller worked through the growing lattice of connections that now surrounded the death of Helen French. And in the squad room, the air carried the scent of stale coffee and carbon paper, the quiet urgency of detectives following threads that refused to align neatly, because although Richard Calder remained at the center of their attention, the case had begun to widen in ways that suggested Helen's life held more complexity than first assumed, and Keller sat with a stack of transcripts from interviews conducted the previous night, noting the recurring theme that Helen had seemed distracted in the week leading up to her death, preoccupied with something she had not shared. And Stone stood near the evidence board, studying the timeline they had assembled, each detail pinned in place like a marker along a route whose destination remained uncertain. And he asked Keller to review again the cab driver's statement, because while the identification of Calder had been tentative, it represented the first external account placing him near Helen's apartment on the night in question. And Keller read from his notes that the driver believed he had picked up a well-dressed man downtown around 10:15 and dropped him off near Helen's block shortly thereafter, though he could not confirm the exact address or the passenger's name, only that the man had seemed in a hurry and paid in cash, a detail that added a subtle weight to the possibility that Calder's alibi was not as solid as he claimed. And Stone nodded, aware that such fragments, when combined, could form a pattern persuasive enough to justify further pressure, and he instructed Keller to bring Calder in again for a second interview, this time with the cab driver available for a potential identification. because sometimes the mere suggestion of corroboration was enough to shift a suspect's confidence, and as the morning progressed, they also received a report from forensics indicating that while there were no clear fingerprints linking Calder to the apartment beyond what might be expected from previous visits, there were signs of a struggle consistent with the timeline they had established, and the absence of forced entry continued to support the theory that Helen had known her visitor and allowed him inside willingly. And when Calder arrived at the station later that afternoon, he appeared more tense than during the first interview, his composure intact but less relaxed, as if the weight of the investigation had begun to press against his carefully maintained exterior. And Stone began by revisiting the timeline of the night in question, asking Calder to account for his movements in greater detail. And Calder repeated his earlier statement that he had been home working, though this time there was a slight hesitation before each answer, a subtle shift in posture that Keller noticed and noted, and when Stone mentioned the possibility of a cab driver placing him near Helen's apartment that night, Calder's expression tightened almost imperceptibly before he recovered and said that while he might have taken a cab earlier in the evening, he had not gone to Helen's apartment, suggesting instead that he had been out briefly for dinner and returned home well before 10. And Keller asked why he had not mentioned that earlier, and Calder replied that he had not considered it relevant, a response that hung in the room with a faint weight of inconsistency, and Stone allowed the silence to linger for a moment before asking whether Helen had been expecting him that night, whether they had argued recently, and Calder insisted that there had been no argument, though he admitted they had discussed the future of their relationship and that Helen had seemed uncertain about continuing to see him, a detail that introduced the possibility of emotional tension that might have escalated, and as the interview continued, Stone observed the small signs of strain in Calder's demeanor, the way his hands moved slightly when he spoke, the way his gaze shifted toward the door, as if measuring the distance between himself and the exit, and when they finally concluded the session and Calder left, Stone turned to Keller and said that while they still lacked definitive proof, the inconsistencies in Calder's account were beginning to accumulate, forming a pattern that could not be ignored, and Keller agreed, noting that the combination of the cab driver's statement, the neighbor's description, and Calder's evolving timeline suggested he had been closer to Helen's apartment that night than he was willing to admit, and as evening fell they began the process of verifying Calder's revised story, checking restaurant receipts, speaking with staff, and reviewing any available records that might confirm or contradict his claims. And in the course of this work, Keller uncovered another detail that added depth to the case. Helen had recently withdrawn a significant sum of money from her bank account, an action that did not align with her usual financial habits and suggested she had been preparing for something or responding to a situation that required immediate resources. And Stone considered this carefully, because sudden financial changes often intersected with personal conflicts, and if Helen had been under pressure, emotional, financial, or otherwise, that pressure might have drawn Calder into a confrontation that ended violently, and as they drove through the city that night, retracing the route the cab driver described, the streets felt both familiar and newly charged with significance, each intersection a potential link in the chain of events that had led to Helen's death. And Keller asked whether they were close to making an arrest, and Stone replied that closeness in an investigation was measured not by distance but by clarity, and while the picture was sharpening, it was not yet clear enough to act without risk, because a premature move could compromise the case and allow the truth to slip away, and so they continued their methodical work, gathering statements, verifying timelines, and watching for the moment when the evidence would align with certainty, knowing that somewhere within the shifting details of Helen's final days lay the answer they needed. And as midnight approached once again, the city settled into its nocturnal quiet, unaware that within the walls of the station 2 detectives were inching closer to understanding what had happened in a small apartment on the 3rd floor of a building where a woman named Helen French had once lived an ordinary life until the night someone came to her door and changed everything. And Stone, standing at the edge of the squad room with Keller beside him, felt the familiar sense of a case approaching its turning point, the moment when speculation gave way to revelation and the story hidden within the evidence began to speak with unmistakable clarity, and until that moment arrived they would continue to follow every lead, no matter how small, because the truth, once uncovered, would demand to be heard, and they intended to make sure it was. The sixth day of the investigation unfolded with a quiet tension that seemed to hum beneath every conversation and every passing hour, and Inspector Mike Stone arrived at the station before sunrise, carrying with him the steady determination that had sustained him through years of cases that began in confusion and ended only when persistence overcame uncertainty, and Sergeant Steve Keller was already at his desk, reviewing the latest reports with a focus sharpened by the knowledge that they were approaching a critical juncture, because while the evidence against Richard Calder had grown more substantial, it remained just shy of the clarity needed to make an arrest without risking the integrity of the case, and Stone set his coat over the back of his chair and asked for a summary of the overnight developments. And Keller reported that the restaurant Calder claimed to have visited on the night of Helen's death had no record of his presence, no receipt, no staff member who remembered serving him, a gap that further weakened his alibi and suggested that his movements during that crucial window remained deliberately obscured, and Stone nodded, aware that such inconsistencies, while not definitive on their own, formed a pattern that could not be ignored, and he instructed Keller to prepare a comprehensive timeline that incorporated every verified detail from Helen's final day, from her departure from work to the last outgoing phone call placed shortly before 10, because understanding the precise sequence of events might reveal a point where Calder's story diverged from reality, and as the morning progressed, they received an additional report from forensics indicating that fibers found on Helen's clothing matched the interior upholstery of a vehicle consistent with Calder's car, a detail that suggested she had either been inside his vehicle recently or that he had been close enough to her in the apartment for the transfer to occur, and while the evidence was still circumstantial, it added another layer to the growing case against him, and Keller, studying the report, remarked that Calder's composure during their interviews might be masking a deeper anxiety, the kind that often emerged when suspects believed they could maintain control of the narrative, and Stone agreed, noting that people who felt confident in their version of events often underestimated the cumulative weight of small details, and those details were now beginning to align in a way that pointed increasingly toward Calder's involvement, and by midday they decided to bring him in once more, this time with a more direct approach, because while they still lacked the single piece of evidence that would close the case, they had enough to challenge his story with greater precision, and when Calder arrived at the station, he appeared more guarded than before, his posture stiff, his responses measured, and Stone began by presenting the inconsistencies in his timeline, the absence of confirmation at the restaurant, the cab driver's statement, and the fiber evidence that suggested proximity to Helen at the time of the struggle, and for a moment Calder maintained his composure, repeating that he had not been at Helen's apartment that night, but as the conversation continued the strain became more apparent, his answers slower, his gaze less steady, and Keller asked whether he had argued with Helen recently, whether there had been a disagreement about their relationship or about the money she had withdrawn from her account, and Calder hesitated before admitting that they had argued about her decision to end their relationship, that she had wanted distance, and that he had not taken the news well, though he insisted he had left her apartment earlier in the week and had not returned, and Stone leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm, and said that they had reason to believe Calder had been there that night, that Helen had opened the door to someone she knew, and that the situation had escalated beyond control, and for a long moment Calder said nothing, his expression caught between defiance and resignation, and when he finally spoke his voice carried a trace of weariness, though he still denied being present at the time of the murder, and after the interview concluded and Calder was escorted out, Stone and Keller stepped into the hallway, both aware that they were nearing the point where evidence and intuition intersected, and Keller said quietly that he believed Calder was holding something back, that the tension in his responses suggested a truth he was unwilling to reveal, and Stone agreed, though he cautioned that belief alone could not close a case, and they would need one more piece of corroboration, something that placed Calder in the apartment at the exact time of Helen's death, and as they returned to their desks the afternoon light filtered through the windows in long, pale beams, the city outside continuing its routine while inside the investigation pressed forward, and Keller began arranging for a search of Calder's apartment and vehicle, hoping that a closer examination might uncover the final detail they needed, and Stone, standing at the evidence board, reviewed the timeline once more, tracing the sequence of events with a finger as if following a path that led inevitably to a single conclusion. And he felt the familiar sense that the case was approaching its resolution, that the scattered fragments of Helen's final hours were beginning to coalesce into a narrative that would soon be undeniable, and as evening fell and the station settled into its quieter nighttime rhythm, the two detectives prepared for the next steps with the steady focus that had guided them from the beginning, knowing that the truth about what had happened in Helen French's apartment was closer than it had been at any point since that first night when the fog and flashing lights had marked the start of a search for answers. And now, with each new detail aligning, the search was nearing its end, though the final confirmation remained just beyond reach, waiting to be uncovered by the careful, deliberate work that defined their profession. And until that confirmation arrived, Stone and Keller would continue to follow every lead, test every assumption, and pursue every possibility. Because in the end, the story of Helen French would demand clarity, and they intended to provide it. The seventh day of the investigation dawned with a brutal clarity that seemed to sharpen every sound and movement within the Hall of Justice, and Inspector Mike Stone arrived with the quiet resolve of a man who sensed the case had reached a threshold beyond which the truth could no longer remain concealed, while Sergeant Steve Keller stood near the evidence board reviewing the compiled timeline for what felt like the 100th time, each detail now arranged in a sequence that pointed more directly toward Richard Calder than ever before, and yet still lacked the single definitive proof that would transform suspicion into certainty. And Stone removed his coat and asked for the latest developments from the overnight search of Calder's apartment and vehicle, and Keller reported that while the search had been conducted with meticulous care, the results were subtle rather than dramatic. Fibers consistent with Helen's clothing found in the passenger seat of Calder's car, a faint smear of what forensics believed might be dried blood near the interior door handle, and a set of recently cleaned shoes whose soles still held traces of dust similar to that found in Helen's apartment hallway. Details that individually might be explained away, but collectively formed a pattern difficult to dismiss, and Stone listened without interruption, absorbing the information as he had absorbed every piece of this case since the first night, and he said quietly that they were approaching the moment when Calder would have to be confronted with the full weight of what they had gathered, because sometimes the accumulation of small truths created a pressure that no denial could withstand, and Keller agreed, though he noted that Calder had maintained his composure through previous interviews and might continue to do so unless presented with something more immediate, something that directly contradicted his account of the night in question. And as if in response to that need, a call came through from the lab confirming that the faint smear in Calder's car tested positive for blood matching Helen's type, a result that did not conclusively prove its origin but significantly strengthened the connection between them on the night of her death. And Stone exchanged a glance with Keller that carried both relief and renewed urgency, because while the evidence was still circumstantial, it had reached a point where a direct confrontation was not only justified but necessary, and they arranged for Calder to be brought in once more, this time with the intention of laying out the evidence in a sequence that would make denial increasingly difficult to sustain. And when Calder entered the interview room that afternoon, he appeared more guarded than ever, his posture rigid, his expression controlled but strained, as if he understood that the investigation had reached a stage from which it would not easily retreat. And Stone began by summarizing the evidence calmly and methodically, describing the inconsistencies in Calder's timeline, the cab driver's statement placing him near Helen's apartment, the fibers linking him to the scene, and finally the blood found in his car. And with each detail, Calder's composure seemed to tighten, his responses shorter, his gaze fixed on the table rather than on the detectives across from him. And Keller asked whether Calder still maintained that he had not been at Helen's apartment that night, and Calder hesitated, his silence stretching long enough to fill the room with a palpable tension, before finally saying that he had gone there, but only to talk, that he had wanted to resolve their disagreement and had believed she might reconsider ending the relationship. And Stone asked him to describe what had happened after he arrived, and Calder spoke slowly, as if measuring each word, explaining that Helen had been upset, that their conversation had escalated into an argument, and that he had left when it became clear she would not change her mind, insisting that she had been alive and unharmed when he walked out. And Keller pressed gently, asking why he had not admitted this earlier, and Calder said he had been afraid of being blamed for something he did not do, a statement that hung in the air with a mixture of plausibility and evasion, and Stone listened carefully, noting the shift in Calder's story, because while he now admitted to being present, he continued to deny involvement in Helen's death, and this partial acknowledgement represented both progress and a new challenge, as it placed him at the scene but did not yet account for the violence that followed. And after the interview concluded and Calder was escorted out once more, Stone and Keller stepped into the hallway, both aware that they had crossed a significant threshold, because Calder's admission of being at the apartment contradicted his earlier statements and placed him directly within the timeline of the crime, and Keller said quietly that the pressure was beginning to show, that Calder's story was evolving in response to the evidence, and Stone agreed, though he cautioned that they still needed to bridge the gap between presence and culpability, to establish not only that Calder had been there but that he had been responsible for the fatal confrontation. And as evening settled over the city once again, the investigation entered a phase of careful consolidation, with Stone and Keller reviewing every detail of Calder's revised account, comparing it against the physical evidence and witness statements, searching for the point at which his narrative diverged from the facts, and in the quiet of the squad room, with the lights dimmed and the city's distant sounds filtering through the windows, Stone felt the familiar sense of a case nearing resolution, the moment when the truth, long obscured by partial answers and guarded denials, began to emerge with unmistakable clarity, and he knew that the next steps would be crucial, because they would determine whether Calder's admission of presence would lead to a full confession or whether the case would require one final piece of evidence to close the circle, and until that moment arrived they would continue their steady, methodical work, guided by the belief that the truth about what had happened in Helen French's apartment was now within reach, waiting only for the final connection that would bring the investigation to its inevitable conclusion. The 8th day of the investigation carried a weight that both Inspector Mike Stone and Sergeant Steve Keller could feel before they even spoke, a quiet pressure that settled over the squad room as the case against Richard Calder began to crystallize into something more tangible than suspicion and more complicated than a straightforward confession, because although Calder had now admitted to being in Helen French's apartment on the night she died, he continued to insist that he had left her alive, and this partial truth hung over the investigation like a fragile bridge between what they knew and what they still needed to prove, and Stone arrived early, as he had each day since the case began, standing for a moment near the window before taking his seat and reviewing the compiled timeline, each detail now annotated and cross-referenced with statements, forensic reports, and the subtle patterns that had emerged over the past week. And Keller joined him with a fresh set of notes, reporting that the lab had completed a more thorough analysis of the fibers and trace evidence recovered from Calder's car and clothing, confirming not only the presence of fibers consistent with Helen's apartment, but also small particles of paint and dust unique to the hallway outside her door, details that further narrowed the gap between Calder's revised account and the physical reality of the scene. And Stone listened with a measured calm, aware that the evidence was converging in a way that suggested the confrontation between Calder and Helen had not ended with a simple departure, and he asked Keller whether any additional witnesses had come forward who might have seen Calder leaving the building later than he claimed, and Keller reported that one resident had recalled hearing footsteps on the stairs shortly after the time of the thud described by the neighbor who found Helen, though the resident could not be certain of the identity of the person descending, only that the timing aligned uncomfortably with the window during which Helen was believed to have died, and this detail, while still circumstantial, added another layer of pressure to Calder's version of events, and as the morning progressed they prepared for another interview, this time with the intention of confronting Calder not with a single piece of evidence, but with the cumulative weight of everything they had gathered. Because in Stone's experience the truth often emerged when a suspect realized that every path of denial led back to the same inescapable point, and when Calder was brought into the interview room, he appeared exhausted. The controlled composure he had maintained in earlier sessions now strained by the persistence of their questioning and the growing awareness that the investigation was closing in, and Stone began by acknowledging Calder's admission that he had been at Helen's apartment, then carefully laid out the timeline as they understood it. His arrival shortly after 10, the argument described by the neighbor, the physical evidence indicating a struggle, and the presence of Helen's blood in his car. And with each point, Calder's posture seemed to tighten, his gaze fixed on the tabletop as if searching for a way to reconcile his story with the facts presented before him, and Keller asked quietly whether Calder was certain he had left when he claimed, whether there had been any physical altercation that might explain the injuries found on Helen, and Calder hesitated, his silence stretching into a moment that felt heavier than any words, before finally saying that the argument had escalated, that Helen had tried to push him out, that he had grabbed her arm, but that he had not intended to hurt her, insisting that when he left she had been shaken but alive, and Stone leaned forward slightly, his voice steady, and said that the medical examiner's report suggested the fatal injury occurred during a struggle consistent with the timeline of Calder's presence, and that no other visitors had been identified entering or leaving the apartment during that window, and the room fell quiet as Calder absorbed this, his expression shifting from guarded defiance to something closer to resignation, and for a moment it seemed as if he might speak, might finally bridge the gap between admission and confession. But instead he said only that he did not remember exactly how the argument ended, that everything had happened too quickly, and Keller, sensing the shift, asked whether he could walk them through the sequence again, from the moment he arrived to the moment he left, and Calder did so in halting detail, his account now including physical contact, raised voices, and a growing sense of panic, though he stopped short of acknowledging responsibility for Helen's death. And when the interview concluded, Stone and Keller stepped out into the hallway, both aware that they were closer than ever to the truth, but still lacking the final confirmation that would allow them to close the case with certainty, and Keller remarked that Calder's memory seemed to sharpen only where it served him, leaving the crucial moment blurred by claims of confusion, and Stone agreed, noting that such selective recollection often signaled a reluctance to confront the full reality of what had occurred, and as they returned to the squad room they reviewed the evidence once more, searching for the detail that would anchor Calder's evolving narrative to the physical facts of the scene, and in the quiet hours of the afternoon they received a call from the lab indicating that a fragment of fabric found under Helen's fingernails matched the material of Calder's jacket, a detail that suggested a struggle more intense than he had described and placed him in direct contact with her at the moment of resistance. And when Keller relayed this to Stone there was a brief silence between them, the kind that marked the realization that the final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, and Stone said quietly that it was time to bring Calder in again, this time not just to question but to confront him with the full scope of what they had uncovered, because the truth, once assembled, had a way of asserting itself with a clarity that no denial could withstand, and as evening settled over the city, once more the two detectives prepared for what they knew would be the decisive conversation, the one that would determine whether Calder's partial admissions would finally give way to a full acknowledgement of what had happened in Helen French's apartment. And as they walked down the corridor toward the interview room, the weight of the case felt both heavy and inevitable, because after days of careful work, patient questioning, and relentless attention to detail, the story that had begun with a quiet knock on a third-floor door was now approaching its final revelation, and they intended to see it through to the end, no matter how difficult that end might be for the man who sat waiting on the other side of the table, because the truth about Helen French deserved nothing less than their full and unwavering commitment. The 9th day of the investigation arrived with a subdued gravity that neither Inspector Mike Stone nor Sergeant Steve Keller attempted to ignore, because after more than a week of assembling fragments, revisiting timelines, and confronting Richard Calder with the gradual accumulation of evidence, they had reached the stage where every remaining question circled the same central point, and the quiet certainty that often preceded resolution settled over the squad room like a low, steady hum, and Stone stood at the evidence board reviewing the latest laboratory confirmation that the torn fragment of fabric found beneath Helen French's fingernails matched the jacket Calder had been seen wearing earlier in the week, a detail that suggested direct physical resistance at the moment of struggle and placed him not just in her apartment, but in immediate contact with her during the final confrontation. And Keller joined him with the updated transcript of Calder's most recent interview, in which his account had shifted from complete denial to partial acknowledgement of an argument and physical contact, though he continued to insist that he had left before anything irreversible occurred, and Stone read the transcript carefully, noting the places where Calder's recollection faltered, the moments where his language grew vague or evasive. And he said quietly that they were approaching the point where Calder's own narrative would either solidify into a full admission or collapse under the weight of contradiction, and Keller agreed, adding that the cumulative evidence now formed a pattern difficult to reconcile with Calder's claim that he had left Helen alive, because the timeline established by the medical examiner, combined with the witness statements and physical evidence, left little room for another visitor or another explanation. And as the morning progressed, they prepared for what would likely be the final extended interview, arranging the evidence in a sequence that would present the clearest possible picture of what had happened that night, not as an accusation delivered in anger, but as a narrative supported by fact. And when Calder was brought into the interview room, he appeared visibly worn, the composure he had maintained in earlier sessions now replaced by guarded fatigue, as if the strain of holding his story together had begun to erode his confidence. And Stone began calmly, summarizing once more what they knew, that Calder had visited Helen's apartment shortly after 10, that an argument had been heard by a neighbor, that physical evidence placed him in close contact with her during a struggle, and that the timeline of her death aligned with the period during which he admitted to being present. And Keller added that the fragment of fabric found under her fingernails indicated she had fought back, suggesting a confrontation that had escalated beyond a simple disagreement. And for a long moment Calder said nothing, his gaze fixed on the table, his hands clasped together as if holding onto the last remnants of control. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a subdued resignation, acknowledging that the argument had grown more heated than he had initially described, that Helen had insisted their relationship was over and had demanded that he leave, and that he had become frustrated, grabbing her in an attempt to make her listen, though he continued to insist that he had not intended to harm her. And Stone listened without interruption, allowing the silence that followed to settle into the room, because sometimes silence created space for the truth to emerge more clearly than any question. And after a moment, he asked Calder to walk them through the exact sequence of events once more, from the moment he arrived to the moment he left, emphasizing the importance of accuracy not for their sake, but for the sake of understanding what had happened. And Calder spoke slowly, describing the argument, the raised voices, the moment when Helen tried to push past him toward the door, and his attempt to stop her. And as he spoke, his words began to falter, the narrative losing its coherence as the weight of memory pressed against his attempts to maintain distance from the outcome. And Keller asked quietly whether Helen had fallen during the struggle, whether there had been a moment when things moved too quickly to control. And Calder's silence in response felt heavier than any denial, his shoulders sagging slightly as if the effort of holding his story together had become too great. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, acknowledging that there had been a struggle, that he had pushed her, that she had fallen and struck her head, and that in the panic that followed he had left, telling himself she would recover, that the injury was not serious, that he would return later or call for help, though he had done neither. And the room remained still as the implications of his words settled into place, not as a sudden revelation, but as the culmination of days of careful investigation and incremental truth. And Stone leaned forward slightly, his voice steady, and asked whether Calder understood that leaving her in that condition had sealed the outcome, that his decision to walk away had turned a moment of anger into a fatal consequence. And Calder nodded faintly, his expression reflecting a mixture of regret and inevitability. And when the interview concluded and Calder was escorted out, Stone and Keller stepped into the hallway, both aware that the case had reached its resolution not through a dramatic confession but through the slow erosion of denial, the gradual alignment of evidence and admission that had brought them to this point. And Keller said quietly that the truth had finally surfaced, and Stone agreed, though he noted that resolution did not erase the tragedy of what had occurred, because Helen French's life had ended not through premeditation but through a chain of choices that had escalated beyond control. And as they returned to the squad room to finalize the reports and prepare the case for formal charges, the city outside continued its routine, unaware that within the walls of the station the story that had begun with a quiet knock on a third-floor door had reached its conclusion. And Stone, standing once more at the evidence board, removed the final pin from the timeline, aware that while the investigation was ending, the impact of its outcome would linger for those involved, a reminder of how quickly ordinary lives could intersect with irreversible consequences. And as the evening settled over San Francisco, once again the case of Helen French moved from the uncertainty of investigation to the clarity of resolution, carried forward by the steady, methodical work of two detectives who had followed every thread until the truth revealed itself in full. The fog had thinned to a pale gauze drifting between the hills when Keller and Stone stepped out of the unmarked sedan and into the late afternoon light that slanted across the courthouse steps, and the city felt as though it were holding its breath, not with the urgency of a fresh crime, but with the deeper, more lingering tension that came from a truth approaching the surface, whether anyone wanted it or not. And Keller sensed it in the way pedestrians paused a fraction too long at crosswalks, and in the echo of their own footsteps as they crossed the polished floor toward the clerk's office, because the case of Helen French had stopped being a simple investigation and had turned into something heavier, something that pressed against memory and reputation and the carefully constructed illusions that people built around themselves to survive in a city where every street corner carried a story and most of them were never told in full. Stone, still carrying the restless energy of someone new enough to the job to believe that answers, once found, would settle things, kept glancing at Keller as if hoping for reassurance. But Keller knew that reassurance was a luxury detectives rarely possessed, and instead he gave the younger man a quiet nod that meant only that they would keep moving forward, because that was what they did. Even when the ground beneath the case shifted in subtle ways that suggested the truth was not a single revelation but a series of small fractures, leading back to the same fault line. And today, as they waited for the clerk to retrieve a set of records that had been buried beneath procedural indifference, Keller found himself thinking again about Helen French, not as a victim, but as a person who had walked these same streets, who had passed through these same doors, who had trusted the same systems that now struggled to make sense of her absence. The file arrived in a manila envelope that seemed too ordinary to contain anything of consequence. Yet Keller felt a familiar tightening in his chest as he opened it and began to read, because the language of official reports often concealed more than it revealed, and the notes they were looking for had been written in a careful hand that suggested someone had tried very hard to appear methodical while avoiding certain details. And Stone leaned closer, scanning the lines, his brow furrowing as he recognized the pattern of omissions, the small hesitations in phrasing that indicated uncertainty or perhaps fear, and Keller let the silence stretch between them as they absorbed what lay in front of them, because sometimes the most important part of an investigation was not the discovery itself, but the moment when the shape of the case shifted, when the narrative that had seemed stable began to tilt, revealing the possibility that what they had assumed about Helen's last hours might not be entirely accurate. Outside, the traffic moved in steady waves, horns echoing faintly through the glass, and Keller closed the file with deliberate care, feeling the weight of its contents settle into his thoughts, and he turned to Stone with a look that conveyed both caution and determination, because they had reached a point where every decision mattered, where every conversation could either clarify or complicate the truth, and he knew that the next step would require them to revisit places they had already searched, to speak again with people who believed they had said everything worth saying, to listen not just for words but for the spaces between them. And as they left the courthouse and stepped back into the shifting light of the city, Keller felt the familiar rhythm of the job reassert itself, the steady forward motion that carried detectives through doubt and fatigue and the quiet accumulation of details that, taken together, formed a path toward understanding. And yet, he could not shake the sense that the case of Helen French was leading them toward something more personal than he preferred, something that touched on the fragile boundary between public duty and private consequence, because the names in the file were not strangers, but people who lived and worked within the same network of streets and offices that defined his own daily routine, and that proximity made every revelation feel closer, sharper, more immediate. And as they drove toward their next destination, the city unfolding around them in layers of shadow and light, Keller allowed himself a brief moment of reflection, acknowledging the fatigue that had begun to settle into his bones, the quiet awareness that time did not move differently for detectives than it did for anyone else, that each case added another weight to carry, another memory to file away, and yet he also felt the stubborn resolve that had kept him in this work for so many years, the belief that even when answers came slowly, even when they arrived tangled in contradiction, they still mattered, because someone had to follow the threads, someone had to care enough to keep asking questions long after others had moved on, and Helen French, whatever the complexities of her life and the circumstances of her death, deserved that persistence, deserved the effort it took to piece together the fragments of her story and return them, in some form, to the light. Stone broke the silence as they turned onto a quieter street lined with aging buildings whose windows reflected the dimming sky, asking whether Keller thought they were close to the truth, and Keller considered the question carefully, aware that the word close could mean many things, could imply an end that might still be far away, and he answered with the measured honesty that had defined his mentorship of the younger detective, telling him that they were closer than they had been yesterday, and that sometimes that was the only certainty they could claim, and Stone nodded, absorbing the lesson, his gaze returning to the road ahead as if the answer itself were a compass pointing them forward. The address they approached belonged to a man whose connection to Helen had seemed peripheral at first, a minor detail in a broader narrative, but the documents in the envelope suggested otherwise, hinting at conversations and encounters that had not been fully disclosed, and as they parked and stepped out into the cool evening air, Keller felt the familiar shift into investigative focus, the narrowing of attention that allowed him to set aside distractions and concentrate on the task at hand, and he glanced at Stone once more, offering a quiet reminder to listen carefully, to observe not just what was said but how it was said, because in cases like this the truth often revealed itself in tone and hesitation rather than in direct statements, and together they walked toward the building's entrance, the hum of the city receding slightly as they crossed into the dim hallway that smelled faintly of dust and old paint, and Keller knocked on the door with a steady hand, aware that each knock in an investigation carried its own weight, its own potential to open or close doors in more ways than one, and when the door finally opened and the man inside looked out at them with a mixture of surprise and resignation, Keller felt the subtle shift that signaled another step forward, another chance to draw the scattered pieces of Helen French's story into a clearer shape, and he introduced himself and Stone with the calm authority that came from years of practice, explaining that they needed to ask a few more questions, that the case was not yet closed, that there were still details requiring clarification, and as they stepped inside and the door closed behind them, Keller sensed that whatever answers lay ahead would not be simple, would not arrive neatly packaged or easily understood, but he also knew that they would continue, as they always did, moving from one conversation to the next, from one fragment of truth to another, until the picture that emerged, however imperfect, honored the reality of what had happened and the memory of the woman at its center, because in the end that was what the work demanded, not certainty or closure in the conventional sense, but the willingness to keep searching, to keep listening, to keep piecing together the story until it could be told with as much honesty and care as the circumstances allowed. And as Keller settled into the chair offered to him and opened his notebook, he felt the familiar alignment of purpose and responsibility, the quiet understanding that this was where he needed to be, asking questions, following leads, and carrying the investigation forward into whatever truths awaited them in the hours and days ahead. Morning arrived with a muted brightness that softened the hard lines of the city, and Keller stood for a moment outside the precinct before going in, watching the traffic build and listening to the low, continuous murmur that seemed to rise from the streets themselves, because there was something about the hour just after dawn that made him reflective, a time when the city felt briefly suspended between what it had been and what it was about to become, and he found himself thinking again about Helen French, about the way her name had woven itself into the daily rhythm of his work, no longer just a case file but a presence that lingered in every decision he made, every question he asked, and when Stone joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a look of determined focus that spoke of a night spent reviewing notes and timelines, Keller accepted the cup with a quiet nod, and together they went inside, moving through the familiar corridors toward their desks, where the case continued to unfold in small, deliberate increments, The meeting they had scheduled for that morning had the potential to shift the direction of the investigation in a way neither of them could yet fully predict, because the person they were about to question had appeared only briefly in earlier reports, a peripheral figure whose connection to Helen had seemed incidental, yet the documents they had uncovered suggested otherwise, hinting at conversations and encounters that placed him closer to the center of events than anyone had previously realized. And as Keller reviewed the notes once more, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest that accompanied the approach of a pivotal moment, the awareness that a single interview could either clarify the path forward or lead them into a new labyrinth of uncertainty. They drove in near silence, each absorbed in his own thoughts, the city unfolding around them in a series of familiar landmarks that nevertheless felt subtly altered by the weight of the case they carried. And when they arrived at the office building and made their way inside, Keller observed the small details that often went unnoticed by others, the way the receptionist's smile faltered when they introduced themselves, the quick glance she cast toward the hallway as if measuring whether to warn someone of their arrival, and he stored these impressions away without comment, knowing that such details could later prove significant in ways that were not immediately apparent. The man they had come to see greeted them with a politeness that bordered on stiffness, his manner carefully controlled, and as they sat across from him in a modest office filled with the faint scent of paper and furniture polish, Keller began with the same measured tone he had used countless times before, explaining that they were continuing to review the circumstances surrounding Helen's death and that certain aspects of her recent activities had prompted them to seek clarification, and the man listened with a fixed expression, nodding occasionally. Yet Keller noticed the subtle tension in his posture, the way his hands remained clasped tightly together as if to prevent them from betraying any nervous movement, and when he spoke, his answers were precise but slightly rehearsed, suggesting that he had anticipated this conversation and had prepared accordingly. Stone asked a series of straightforward questions, moving carefully through the timeline, and Keller watched as the man responded, noting where his confidence wavered, where his gaze shifted, and gradually a picture began to form, not a complete one, but a sketch of interactions that placed Helen in a more complex network of relationships than they had previously understood. And when Keller asked about a meeting that had taken place on the afternoon before her death, the man hesitated just long enough for the pause to register, then offered an explanation that seemed plausible on the surface, yet lacked the natural flow of genuine recollection, and Keller felt the familiar sense that they were approaching the edge of something important, a boundary beyond which the narrative would either break open or harden into denial. After the interview ended, they returned to the car and sat for a moment without speaking, allowing the conversation to settle in their minds. And Stone finally broke the silence by pointing out the inconsistencies he had noted, the subtle shifts in the man's story that suggested he was holding something back, and Keller agreed, though he cautioned that such impressions needed to be supported by evidence, that intuition alone was not enough to build a case, and they drove back toward the precinct, already discussing the next steps, the additional records they would need to obtain, the people they would need to speak with again, and as the day unfolded into a steady progression of calls and meetings, Keller felt the investigation tightening, drawing together the scattered threads that had once seemed unrelated, and by late afternoon, when the light began to fade and the city's shadows lengthened across the streets, he sensed that they were closer than ever to understanding what had happened to Helen French, not in a single dramatic revelation, but in the gradual convergence of facts and observations that, taken together, formed a clearer picture of the truth. And as he sat at his desk reviewing the day's notes, he allowed himself a brief moment of reflection, acknowledging both the progress they had made and the work that still lay ahead, because he knew that the final answers, when they came, would carry a weight that extended beyond the case itself, touching the lives of those who had known Helen and perhaps altering the course of their own. And with that thought in mind, he closed the file for the evening, aware that tomorrow would bring new questions, new conversations, and perhaps the final pieces needed to complete the story they had been assembling with such careful persistence. The final day of the investigation arrived not with a dramatic flourish, but with the quiet, persistent clarity that often follows weeks of steady, patient work, and Keller felt it as soon as he stepped onto the street that morning, a subtle sense that the pieces of Helen French's story had at last begun to align in a way that would allow them to see the whole rather than only scattered fragments. And as he drove toward the precinct with the familiar rhythm of the city unfolding around him, he considered the path that had led them here, the interviews revisited, the timelines refined, the small details that had gradually revealed their significance, and he knew that what awaited them now was not simply the confirmation of facts, but the difficult task of bringing those facts into the open, because the truth, once fully assembled, carried consequences that extended beyond the boundaries of the case itself, touching the lives of everyone connected to it, including his own and Stone's, who met him at the station with a look that reflected both anticipation and the weight of what they were about to do. They gathered in the interview room with the files spread across the table, the photographs and reports arranged in a careful sequence that traced the arc of Helen's final days, and Keller began to speak in the measured, deliberate tone that had guided them through each stage of the investigation, outlining the connections they had uncovered, the discrepancies that had led them from one lead to another, and the pattern that had finally emerged from the accumulation of evidence. And as he spoke, Stone followed along, adding details where the younger man's sharper memory for recent conversations filled in the spaces between Keller's broader observations, and together they constructed a narrative that no longer relied on speculation but on the steady weight of documented fact, a narrative that pointed unmistakably toward the person whose actions had set the tragedy in motion, not through a sudden outburst of violence, but through a chain of decisions and deceptions that had narrowed Helen's options until she found herself in a situation from which there was no safe return. When they brought that person into the room, the atmosphere shifted in a way that was almost tangible, the air itself seeming to grow heavier as the reality of what they had discovered settled over everyone present. And Keller watched carefully as he explained their findings, noting the changes in expression, the moments of resistance followed by the gradual erosion of denial, because he knew from experience that truth often revealed itself not in a single confession but in the slow collapse of the barriers people built to protect themselves from the consequences of their actions. And when the final pieces of evidence were presented, the room fell into a silence that carried its own form of acknowledgement, a recognition that the narrative they had assembled could no longer be dismissed or deflected. The hours that followed were filled with the procedural steps that turned an investigation into a formal case, statements taken, documents signed, and Keller moved through them with a calm efficiency that came from years of practice. Yet beneath that professionalism, he felt the familiar mixture of relief and solemnity that accompanied the resolution of any case involving loss. Because even when the truth was uncovered and responsibility established, nothing could restore what had been taken. Nothing could return Helen French to the life she had once led, and as the day drew toward evening and the final paperwork was completed, Keller stepped outside and allowed himself a moment to breathe in the cool air, watching as the city continued its steady motion around him, unchanged in its outward appearance yet subtly altered by the knowledge that one more story had reached its conclusion. Stone joined him after a while, standing quietly at his side, and for a time they said nothing, the shared experience of the investigation requiring no immediate commentary, and when Stone finally spoke, it was to reflect on the lessons he would carry forward from the case, the importance of patience, of attention to detail, of the willingness to revisit assumptions and follow evidence wherever it led, and Keller listened with a quiet sense of satisfaction, recognizing in the younger detective a growing understanding of the complexities that defined their work, and he offered a few words of his own, not as instruction but as reflection, acknowledging that each case left its mark, shaping the way they approached the next, reminding them that their role was not to seek dramatic endings, but to pursue clarity and accountability with as much care and integrity as possible. As they parted ways and Keller returned to his car, he glanced once more at the skyline, the lights beginning to glow against the deepening blue of the evening, and he thought of Helen not as a victim in a file, but as a person whose story had now been told as fully as circumstances allowed, and he hoped that in some small way the effort they had invested in uncovering the truth had honored her memory, had ensured that the details of her life and death would not be lost in the anonymity of unsolved cases. And as he drove away, the city unfolding before him in familiar patterns of motion and light, He felt the quiet resolution that came from knowing they had done what they could, that they had followed the threads of the case to their conclusion, and that tomorrow, as always, another investigation would begin, another story would call for their attention, and they would answer that call with the same steady commitment that had guided them through this one, carrying forward the lessons and the memories, the weight and the purpose, into whatever lay ahead, because that was the nature of the work and the promise they had made when they first put on the badge, to keep searching, to keep listening, and to keep telling the stories that needed to be told, even when they ended not with triumph, but with the quiet acknowledgement of truth.